Listo, estamos transmitiendo. El día de hoy está con nosotros Killian Dunne. Él es un profesor en grabado, publicaciones y ediciones. Duncan en el Jordan Tons College of Art and Design de la Universidad de Dundee en Escocia. Es artista visual, diseñador e ilustrador. Ha trabajado en diferentes países, ha trabajado en Irlanda, en Alemania, Estados Unidos, Ecuador y en el Reino Unido actualmente. Ha sido galardonado en múltiples concursos a nivel mundial y recientemente publicó un libro de artista llamado Carries of the Marble and Stone. Y eso. Muchas gracias, Killian, por estar el día de hoy con nosotros. Eres más que bienvenido. Estoy muy emocionada por tenerte aquí. Y adelante, el espacio es tuyo. Muchísimas gracias. Adelante.
Gracias. I'll just share my screen here.
You can share.
Oops. Cool. There we go. Oops. Okay. Oops. I have to close and open again to let it share my screen. So just 1 second.
Yeah, okay. Un momento, se fue de la reunión. Si no, creo que no está compartiendo el audio. Your microphone is off. You need to turn on your microphone.
There we go. Can you see the screen okay?
Okay, yeah.
Great. Sorry about that. Yeah, thanks very much. Here we go. So you can see the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much, Cynthia, for inviting me today. And I'll just talk about my kind of career path over the last few years. And I'll try not to talk too quick because I know Irish people speak very fast, so I'll speak slower.
Yes.
So my career background. So I studied printmaking, grabado in Ireland, where I'm from, from 2005 to 2009, and then I worked in a print studio for 2 years on my own work. After which I moved to Canada, where I lived in Niagara Falls and Vancouver. After I won a printmaking award in Canada, so I ended up moving there for the year, getting a year-long visa, and then I returned to Ireland. And I started working for a digital agency as a graphic designer and an illustrator. After that, I moved to Berlin in Germany, and I worked as an app designer and an illustrator in Germany. And when I was in Germany, I was offered a scholarship to study in the School of the Art Institute of Chicago to study my master's in visual communications, where I studied for 2 years and I worked as a teaching assistant in advanced typography and in identity systems and branding. And after that, I moved to Ecuador and I worked in La Central teaching grabado, teaching serigrafía, stenography. And after which I moved to Scotland for my current job, where I am today in the university. So here's some photographs of where I used to work on my own work or for somebody. So I worked in the Black print studio in Dublin. Worked on my own work in the print studio in Vancouver, and then in Germany and in Chicago and then in Ecuador. And this is where I work now in DJ CAD, Duncan of Jordanson College of Art and Design in Scotland, where I teach in first year, second year, third year, printmaking, contemporary art practice, and I work as a supervisor in masters as well in art and philosophy as well. And my artistic and kind of design practice at the moment mostly focuses on artist books. They're what I'm really into right now, and my artist books can be found in these collections, various collections. So just returning to that career path in Ireland, when I was in undergrad, I was working in analog printmaking. I wasn't using computers at all. I don't think I even had an email address for the first 2 years of college. And I was very interested into history and Irish mythology and paganism and Irish magic. I was very much into history and making prints about history and magic, and the First World War was a point of particular interest to me. So all of this, there's no computers, there's no graphic design, so to speak, very early on. So this is my degree show from 2009. So it's all analog, it's all handmade printmaking, and my studio at the time here, you can see it's all very handmade as well. And collage is all everything is not very computery. But then when I moved to Canada, I was still making analog prints, but I started to get more into computers and using Adobe Illustrator and illustration work and some design work and learning more about typography as well. So I started making very digital work for little commissions and little illustrations that people wanted, and gradually started getting more and more into design and moving away from the analog ancient history of grabado. So I started making these little icons, just kind of practicing every day, making little app icons. It's kind of ironic that this one of the Bash Street Kids here, it was a comic book that I used to love when I was a child, but it's actually made in the city that I now live in. So I made these icons over 10 years ago, but now I actually live down the road from the Bash Street. So when I returned from Canada, I started working in Ireland for a digital agency. And I started to learn a lot more about design then when I returned to Ireland. In the digital agency, there was a lot of clients and a lot of work for doing, which was great for new experiences of design. I just put in one of my own design about a little potato character I made. But here's kind of a list of the things I would work on when I worked for that company. So I'd make infographics, I'd make web designs, I'd make app designs, book designs, social media images and social media campaigns, a lot of illustration, icons, and a lot of promotional material. So kind of fast-paced, making a lot of stuff very quickly and learning a lot along the way. I'm a big believer in lifelong learning. I'm still learning every day. So during this period, I used to use Dribbble a lot, Dribbble.com and Behance.com, to always kind of get feedback from other designers and illustrators. I always found it very useful to have an online platform where designers from all around the world could give you advice and feedback and tell you if something looked terrible or not. So they're just the kind of little mock-ups, the little designs I used to make on those websites where you had kind of creative freedom to work on your own illustrations and your own designs away from commercial briefs. So after near 2 years at the company, I went to Germany, I moved to Berlin, and I started to focus on a lot of web design. Here's my old office in Berlin where I first moved. It's just above Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin. And when I was there, the first company I worked for, it was very much promotional material and illustration. And I was in the design team of about 5 people. So a lot of these little illustrations and animations. At this point, I started getting into animation a lot more, just making my little characters come to life. And always had this kind of interest in the robots and zombies, I guess. And then I started really looking at kind of user flows rather than just designing websites or designing pages on apps or on websites. I really started looking at the user flow and kind of trying to advance my design practice into what is the flow of the design. So I started making a lot of these little animations and putting them on Drill for feedback as well, using my own characters as ways of figuring out how to best use the limited space of mobile devices. And then after which I went to an open day of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and then that's when they offered me a scholarship to study at the Art Institute. So then my design practice started to change a lot. And this is my old studio space, working in my studio space in Chicago. Once again, taking photos out the window. I love taking photographs out the window of studios. So once again, I kind of returned to my little characters and my designs and making more animations and applying them to more different ideas. Within the masters, it was a lot more kind of, there was no client, so you really design for yourself and design for your own ideas. So I started to think very differently about design, and I didn't have to answer a brief, like what is writing my own brief, what is self-directed design. So these are some ones I made in the first year. In the first year of the 2-year masters, I did a lot of just experimenting, just figuring out a self-directed design and what that meant. So I started making these little ones about, I don't know what they're about. And then I started making repeat patterns like these. These characters are a mixture of kind of Ecuadorian designs, because my wife is from Ecuador, and so a mixture of kind of Incas and Vikings and Celts, because I'm from Dublin in Ireland, which is a Viking city. So it's a combination of kind of Vikings and Incas, and just having fun with playing these different characters and taking influence from the material, from ancient objects, and turning them into kind of fun illustrations, and then just making little animations out of them as well, these kind of transformations of these characters. So in my first year of my master, very much, as I say, figuring out what is design for myself when there's no brief. And then once again, just always looking at these kind of how you might apply your own design to web spaces. And I started doing these daily challenges as well. So, over the years, where I just design websites just for the fun of it, just for daily practice of playing with typography and layout. These aren't really focused on user experience, so to speak. They mightn't make any sense for the UX design, but they're more just kind of like the aesthetic of them and how they look. And just making one every day where they're kind of free space to explore typography and layout. And always kind of working on those. And then after kind of making these as well, I started getting these different briefs in the masters. When I went into the second year, I really needed to narrow down what I wanted to do with my masters, how I wanted, what did I want out of it, and what was the self-directed design. So I was doing a class project about redesigning a book about an artist, and this is an artist called David Smith. So the people in the class had to redesign the book in their own interpretation. So I wanted to use this project we were given to do something very abstract, to kind of further examine self-directed design. So here's David Smith, a photograph of him. He's an abstract expressionist sculptor. In the middle is the book about him, and on the right is the book I made about him. So he used to make these giant sculptures and put them in his fields, and he rearranged them and curate them in his fields. And he was kind of a mysterious character. No one knew a lot about him, and he died in a car crash fairly young. And he was very insular, and he seemed like a nice guy, but people didn't know a lot about him. And here he is with his two daughters, Candida and Rebecca. And what interested me about the book was that Candida, she wrote a lot of the book. So she grew up to be a kind of a curator. So for this book, I decided, why don't I use a lot of kind of big quotes? So you can read the book as the body text, or you can read it as the quotes, or you can mix and match. And I'm going to highlight quotes in grey if it's coming from her childhood memories, and in raspberry red if it is from the curator. And the reason I've used raspberry red is because he said he'd only ever use colour in his sculptures if he really, really needed to. And he said that a great example of colour to use is raspberry red. That's why I chose raspberry red. So you can read the book as her writing, you can read it as her childhood memories, or you can read it as her as a curator, or you can mix them all together. So, and I also use these white rectangles to represent the sculptures, but also represent kind of his personality, his soul, who he was, because he felt he was kind of at one with his artwork. So these white squares represent what we don't know about this man, but they also represent the sculptures and him, and they coexist. So in the first pages here, I've used, to introduce it, the curator text and the grey text are kind of floating along the field to kind of introduce you to the two different voices that are happening in this book. And then on the front page of the book, the author's name is made with 50% opacity grey and 50% opacity raspberry red. So her name is kind of layered the two different colours to show the two voices, and you have the white square to represent the artist and his artwork. And another idea I had for the book was I never show any artwork because we're looking at who the person was. So I always crop the artwork. So it's by looking at the person rather than his endless artworks that people have seen a million times before. And then the chapters are broken up with this raspberry red page. So the first chapter is very much an introduction to him. The second chapter is about his life before his children and before their mother, because he was married twice. So in this chapter, it's about piecing together who he was, because when it was written, he was dead and his first wife was dead as well. So people don't know a lot about that history. So in this, there's a kind of a misalignment between photograph and white box, and the pages are on tracing, kind of vellum tracing paper as well. So it's about piecing together history that was not really recorded. The third chapter is about the crossover between the childhood and the sculptures, because, for example, when he had a birthday parties for his children, they used to use the sculptures as kind of a playground for the parties. So there was always, because the field and the home house were beside each other, there was always a connection between home life and work life. So this chapter is about using the typography to kind of connect the home life with the work life. So here the white box is used as a Polaroid photograph, and the decoration on the pages, the graphic designs of the pages, are based on his sculptures without ever seeing the sculptures. So the circles and the rectangles are taken from those sculpture designs. And as you can see here, as the chapter progresses, her voice starts to blur from grey to pink, grey to raspberry red, where she's kind of confusing these memories. And then on the last page here, the quotes are exactly the same, but they're just in two different colours. So this kind of crossover of family life and work life as a sculptor. And then in the final chapter, I thought, how could I kind of use the final one was very emotive from her writing. So I thought, how can I use typography to emotionally express her reflections? So in this one, the body text, the essay, pours out of the white box as if it's kind of pouring out tears, so to speak. It just kind of drips out of it and is used. So it's a book about a sculptor, but the text is used in a sculptural manner. And then it jumps between the two voices from page to page, where she says, "My father never knew what a work block was. Ideas rushed in much too fast for him to realize them at all." So that quote is kind of speaking to that body text stripping out the white box as well. For David Smith, his identity as an artist was the personal foundation of everything he was. The sense of I am was all about I am an artist. There was little room for identity about himself in terms of other people, and so he felt lonesome. So you only got a bit of that text towards the end there as well, that kind of cut-off point of he was this kind of lonesome person. So how can you respond emotively to this emotive text through the use of typography? And then on the back of the book, usually in artist books, of course, you get an essay and then you get loads of photographs of the artwork at the end of the book. And the original book had loads and loads of photographs of his sculptures. But I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if I show no sculptures and I only show 3 pages that are covered over by the white rectangle? So in the first one, it's his workshop covered over. Another one is a photograph he took in New York as a young man. And another one is a photograph of inside his studio. So it adds more kind of mystery to it. And then it ends on a black page rather than a raspberry red page. So when I made this book, it was a real kind of eye-opener to me how I can kind of mix my printmaking background with design languages to make artist books rather than design books. And this led me on to this piece of paper. And this piece of paper was my degree show, my graduate show Inspiration in Chicago. Because once again, I was thinking, what is self-directed design? How do I design for myself rather than the client? So I had this piece of paper from 1998. Well, this is a reproduction of the piece of paper because I don't know where it is. But it's my end of school exams in 1998 when I finished school in Ireland. And I did 6 subjects in school. And I didn't really do very well in school. I couldn't spell, for example, and there was no such thing as spell check back then. So I didn't like the way school was organized through spelling and memory rather than the way you should kind of learn things. So I didn't get a lot out of. I felt I didn't get a lot out of the school I went to, and I decided I'd always hated this piece of paper and how it done nothing for my life. You're always told it does so much for your life, your school results, but I felt this was useless for my life, and that all I'd really learned about in school mostly was football, because everyone in school loved football. The teachers love football, I love football, my classmates love football. So I thought about self-directed design. So what happens if I redesign this piece of paper into 6 artist books, and each book is about these 6 subjects, but in relation to a real game of football from history. So I redesigned my piece of paper into 6 books about football, and each of them about a real game from history. So I'm going to show you 2 of these books now, to show you what I mean. So the idea was, I get this piece of paper that was supposed to be useful for my life. It wasn't. It was negative. And I turned it into something that is useful for my life, a portfolio of artist books. So here's a photo of the first book I'll show. And here's some spreads from it. And it's about, I was always interested in the relationship between football and war, particularly in World War One in France and Belgium. So this kind of propaganda about war being like football. And of course, when they used to literally kick a football over the top in the battles in no man's land. And they'd run after the ball. Crazy. So I love this lecture called Working Class Ballet by the philosopher Simon Critchley. It's about phenomenology and football. And I also was very interested in the Christmas Day truce of 1914, where the 2 sides had a truce. They didn't fight on Christmas Day, and instead they played football. So I thought to myself, these 2 strange places. So what happens if I get some of the text from this this lecture by Simon Critchley, and I place it over the game of football in 1914. So if I take that text, put it there, and then generate a book from that, what would happen? And that was my idea for this book. So it's working class ballet layered over a Christmas Day truce. So I play with the typography there with it there too. And it starts with an introduction about what is play, and play being a very abstract thing that exists in the real world. And it's a quote by Dr. Peter Gray about play and rules. And then it has an introduction text that I wrote about the space of the place. And then the guys go over the top to have a game of football and to share drink and cigarettes. And then it's about this relationship of time on no man's land, and how this one day can become your entire life because it's this one unique point in time in history. So the words from the essay become very different when they are placed over this game. So it's about time stopping and phenomenology and philosophy, and how they just kind of go into their own little world, this protected world, where they play football for this one day. And they start to kind of go off into their own little world of reflecting on their lives. And because they don't know what will happen for their lives in the First World War. And so this guy is transported back to his kind of childhood fantasies of becoming a footballer. But there's a reminder under the soil in the trenches that this is only one day. And it just kind of looks at that and this protected space of this game and time stopping in a game. So the typography and my kind of design work and my design practice become very much more arty. That's the back of the book. And then using even things like grid systems, because this is about stopping time. So my grid system for my book is affected by time stopping. So instead of having a square grid around the line of the game, the squares become rectangles. So it starts to affect the layout, the composition, the typography. So playing with the design rules in an art kind of way. And here's some sketches. These are my sketchbooks for it. So your sketchbooks become a lot more arty than they do designy. Lots of scribbling and just kind of figuring it all out there. Just the process. And there's the book. And here's the next book, and it's about the book about history. And I was interested about how we record history with graphic design, with design books, how history can be changed and has to be rewritten. So this was a game of football between Serbia and Albania that got stopped early because of a riot. And I was very interested in it because Serbia were given a 3-0 win, even though the game stopped when there was no goals. And Albania brought it to court, and they were a year and a half later told, actually, you won the game 3-0, not Serbia. So it became this strange situation where, like, no goals were ever scored, the game was never finished, but the history books say that all these events happened, but they never happened. And I was very interested in that. And I really liked it in relation to the map of Napoleon's Russian campaign by Charles Joseph Minard, which is regarded as the great piece of history telling through infographics. It's a masterpiece of infographics. So I like the idea of playing off that, about a game of football that went on for 42 minutes. It had 48 minutes of a game that never happened, but all these goals were supposed to happen. So I decided to instead of making a history book, I made 2 history books. So one of them, Serbia wins 3-0, and the other one, Albania wins 3-0. And it's got all the dates and times in there when these events were supposed to happen. And I was going to fill these books up with all the data from the games. So the referees, the times, what happened every few minutes. I took it from the FIFA website. And it's full of data. But what I like about it is it's full of data, typography, design, but it says nothing. It's really boring to read. It's a rubbish read. They're terrible to read. So it's more like a sculpture that's turning data into a sculpture and making an artist's book full of information that doesn't really give you any real information. And the game ends here because the game ended on the 42nd minute. This is with the game continuing in the 43rd minute, all the way up to the 90th minute. But the game continues in a building because that's where they make decisions rather than on the pitch. So I had great debates about this part of the book with my tutor because we're like, do we just show an empty pitch for 48 minutes or do we show a building? How do we tell a story of a history that never happened with graphic design in a book? So we had fantastic debates about that. But in the end, we went for this. And here is the second book, which contains an extra chapter called The Replay. And this is where the 3-0 win for Serbia turns into a 3-0 win for Albania. But it all happens in an office rather than on a football pitch. So how do you tell a story with graphic design when history is strange? And here's some photographs of the books. And that's the two books together. It's got the photographs from the event. It's got the data. So they're sculptural books using graphic design. Then I finished in SAIC in Chicago. And then I moved to Ecuador and I started working in La Central. And there during the lockdown, while teaching screen printing, of course, graphic design skills came in very handy for online teaching to make teaching material and how to best use your graphic design skills to teach under very difficult circumstances of the pandemic. And then how you might use graphic design skills for when you're making screen prints as well. Very useful as well. And then to Scotland, 2020, I moved here. Here's a more recent project made in the Forgan Art Centre near my house. And this is a series of events where there is an event where artists are invited to talk about a subject and they collect the food materials or maybe look at the food materials in the garden of the art centre. And then artists speak at the event, and then people cook together at the event to make the food. This is a project that was designed by my wife, Desiree. So she would invite 3 artists or 3 creative people to speak about food, and then everybody cooks the food together and has a conversation. Here's people cooking. We did a hamburger one, and the talks about them. So there was 3 events like this. And then in response to it, we designed a publication which has 17 different people who were involved with the event or who were invited. And it's 17 different pieces of work brought together into a publication, all talking about food and politics, food and memory, etc. So I designed this newspaper publication, and it's got artists' books inside as well as the publication. So this was a fun project to do, thinking very differently about design and how you get lots of voices and bring them together into one space, into one book. Here's the inside of the book, and you can see the different elements here as well. It's got little artist books inside and little postcards. It was a really good project to do. It's got artworks, it's got recipes, etc. It's got reflections. And here's the artists speaking from the publication at the launch of the publication. It's an edition of 250. So here's 2 of the artists speaking. One of them is reading a poem. The other one is reading a recipe about climbing a mountain and making ravioli on the mountain. And then here's the opening event, which once again had lots of food in it as well. So a really interesting project about food. So we did that early in the year. And then this is a book. This is one of the latest books I made. It's about World War One again, because I never stopped talking about World War One. And it's a book I always wanted to make. What I did was I wrote an academic paper about Michel Foucault's heterotopias in relationship to the First World War. And I've always wanted to write a paper, but then turn it into an artist's book and really play with typography. You can break as many rules with typography as you want. You can respond to typography any way you want. It's something I've always wanted to do, so I made this book. So it's a big book, and when you get an opening page like this, you can fold it out. So each page is a triptych. So you have images, elements that support the text, and the text itself. So there's a full paper in there, but as it goes on and speaks more and more about the First World War and the Western Front, and in relationship to Foucault's heterotopias, it gets more abstract and it starts to break down a bit. So the typography is set up like a trench would be set up. So it's kind of constructed. People would, dig up pieces of wood and construct. So instead of me using InDesign or Illustrator, I only used Photoshop and expanded the text, so the text was always an object, and just built with the typography. So building with typography rather than designing with typography. So the more it goes on, the more kind of messy it gets, because the more messy the war gets, because the war went on for 4 years. So the landscape gets more and more messed up. And then there's a breaker bit here using photographs, and I use photographs that happened before the war, because a lot of it is about time and timelines. And once again, like the David Smith book, I didn't want to show any photographs of the war. I wanted to look at the war from a different lens, where you're not just looking at the First World War all day long. You're looking at the social constructions that led to the war, where the ideas about sport and running and football and the glorification of war through sport. So here you can see the pages are getting more and more messy, but they're composed. They're not completely random. There is a kind of a structure there. In the same way the trenches of the First World War had a structure, but they were messy. So the book is doing the same thing. The typography of the book is doing the same thing as the trenches. And it gets more and more messy. Related to it. So as you can see, there's a young guy jumping out of some water there. So it's all about mud, and where the rain and mud in the trenches, but all the photographs are kind of echoing these ideas. And it just kind of progresses on a bit, kind of looking at text relationship to it. Some of these postcards, I bought them in France, that's the text from First World War soldiers. So I use a lot of my own material that I've collected for myself, because it's about the relationship as well between text and kind of spaces as well. Because Foucault his ideas on heterotopias were related between, they started with text and writing and moving into spaces that exist in the real world. And then at the end here, that very last page on the right, that's the bibliography. So the bibliography is all messed up and all the typography is mixed up, like the landscape of the First World War. And here's the photographs I used that I mentioned. These are from the 1800s, late 1800s in Scotland. I got them from the online archive. And I was just really amazed by when you crop them down, you just crop, they become very different photographs. They become kind of poetic and tragic and sad, and they relate to going over the top is the big expression in the First World War. So this is about high jumps, going into no man's land, going over the top. So when you zoom in on these photos, they become quite different. They became my source material. And once again, that comes back from David Smith, of course. So every class project will always inform future projects. The mud, the First World War, it's so synonymous with it. And the spectacle of the First World War, of course. Usually some photographs, typography. So these pieces of typography, as I say, they look structured, but they look messy at the same time. So you can kind of look through them and read the bits you want to read even. And of course there's the bibliography on the right. So you have to kind of move through the text to find the references. And then after that, I wanted to, it's an ongoing project, so I wanted to make a response to that one, and I wanted to keep churning the idea. So I made a new version where I cut out all the essay, I removed my own writing, and I just left the quotes, and I just left the images. And then I set them up on these pieces of paper, with their crop marks there. And then I printed them on tracing paper, and I made a new version here. And in this one, you can read the book from top to bottom, from left to right, or you can read through the book because of the tracing paper. So there's no right or wrong way to read the book. And the idea of an essay or an atmosphere, using typography as an atmosphere, becomes very, very abstract. So it's down to the viewer how they read it. And as you might see there's clips on it too, so you can rearrange the book. You can organize the running order the way you want. It's up to the viewer. They can make their own running order of the book. So the book is different every time. So if you were reading it in a gallery, you could rearrange it and leave it, and the next person picks up the book, they read it in a different way. So the typography is always jumbled and mixed up. Because it's more about typography as an atmosphere rather than a beginning, a middle, and an end. And there are just some shots of it in there. So leaving the narrative over to chance as well. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Killian. Tienes un largo trabajo y es muy impresionante la investigación que haces para presentarlo. I want to answer you, how have the different geographical contexts in which you have been influenced your work?
Oh, that's a good question. Of different places I lived. That's a great question. I think a lot, yeah. Because in Ireland, it was very much local history, family history. And then in Berlin, where I worked, in the offices were very international. So I practiced a lot of German before I moved to Germany, but when I went to the offices, everyone just spoke English. So because it was, and the reason was because there'd be 30 different nationalities in one space. So I get a lot of influence from all different countries. And then when I went to the United States, I think I got a lot of influence from very different tutors who were American, and particularly their influence on typography. I got a different lens, an American history on typography as well that I didn't really know about until I met those tutors, the way they influenced as well. And then in Ecuador as well, great way of thinking. I learned a lot in the Central and different processes. I think the ways of making, particularly in Ecuador as well. So lots of influences from everywhere, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you. ¿Ustedes tienen tal vez alguna pregunta? ¿Entendieron? No.
As a designer, what is your recommendation for finding inspiration in the social context that allows design graphic products that connect with people? That's a good question. I think it depends on the project. So I would say always keep an eye out for online talks, live events, like Zoom events where there's live conversations happening. So if one sounds like one that's like, that's very specific to me, what I'm interested in, like let's say an app design, that the kind of the contemporariness of that conversation happening online at that time, and how people are responding to it then, that because there's live conversations happening rather than an article. So I think live events, keeping an eye on the most amount of resources on that front, and conversation and debate at those events. Sure.
¿Ustedes? No, nada. Acércate, Pablo.
Hi, Killian. Nice to meet you. I'm
Hey,
Pablo. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I read a lot of football, like you said, and it was like, I have a question. For the kind of book that you have about football, how was like the research and the idea that you have to make it? It was like very impressive at the match that you say of Serbia and Albania.
Well,
And
Albania.
it was like very interesting. I just want to know how was the process to make it and the idea.
Oh, that's a great question. I think, well, what I like about those books is that so much, there's a real blur of kind of research and personal interest in football, because I'm a total football nerd. I'm a total dork on football. So I think certainly you should kind of go with that if you're a total nerd about football, that research kind of happens by itself and you find strange connections between your design process and your interest in football, and just finding your personal voice within that. For me, I'd always been interested. I think with that I was interested in that game, but I'm also interested very much in time, recording of history, how history we learn, or history is taught by the winner, as they say. So how we record history. So always think about things that are a passion for you, like football, how they're a lens. I always think of the word lens, how you can use that as a lens to view anything. So you can view anything in the world through football or food, like the Living Table project. So you can use it as a lens, but how can it be a design lens as well? It has certain rules about it. Football, for example, has 90 minutes of time. It has extra time. It has stopping and starting of time. Injury time is becoming more and more abstract in football. We're seeing a lot of 14 minutes of injury time, for example. So they've got design structures. A football match has design structure. So, for example, those books, the dimension of the book is based on football programs that you buy at a football match, and the dimensions of certain grids can be based on the dimensions of football pitches. So how you can take the framework, a design framework, from one thing and bring it as a language and as a lens to another subject as well.
Thank you so much.
That's a great question. I hope I made sense there with that one.
Very good. ¿Alguien tiene una pregunta? Sí.
Yes, hi everyone. My question is like, where did you find inspiration, especially focus in typography? Because I know it's the basics and it's really important because a good typography to express the essence of our project, or especially in this whole context, like these social events.
Yep, that's a great question. I think with typography, it is that kind of thing of knowing the rules to break the rules. So finding examples of rules well done, but then examples of rules broken really well. So rules well done is, Swiss typography after World War II. But rules broken really well are people like David Carson, Chris Ashworth, Patrick Thomas. If you look at designers like them, the way they play with the history of typography. April Greiman, she was a legendary designer from the 1980s. if you look at those kind of postmodern typography movements and see how they broke the rules and why they broke the rules. But I would recommend those designers for sure. Patrick Thomas, at the moment, he's contemporary. He's doing new, interesting stuff all the time. And from the 90s, it would be David Carson and Chris Ashworth. And what they did with kind of the postmodern, particularly with kind of grunge typography for the kind of music magazines of the 90s as well, is really interesting as well. So I think it could be a mix of kind of tracking the careers of those designers, and the ones that are of interest to you, because the great thing about designers is they're around for 50 years, so their work changes. Like if you look at, Jan Tschichold from the 1920s, he wrote the new typography. He wrote all those kind of rules that became Swiss typography. But after World War II, he rejected his own rules because he said, well, I was 27 years old when I wrote that book, but now I'm 50, whatever, and I don't think I changed my mind. I've got new interests. And to see the timeline of how his work changed because of that as well. So if you're looking at, I think always look at the timeline of why typography changes, particularly in the 20th century, and why it changes, why designers respond in different ways. Some people were very innovative, but then they reject their own rules, like Jan Tschichold. There's a great book as well. I'll just look it up here. One second here, sorry. It's called Just My Type, is the name of the book, and it's by, who's the author? Simon Garfield. So like the cat. So Simon Garfield's book, Just My Type, it's called. And it has got a really, really interesting way of looking at why type is the way it is. And it's got lots of funny stories in it about, there's a type designer who designed a type, I think in the 1980s, but he was watching, say, Private Ryan, the World War II film, and he saw his typography in the film. So his typography made in the 80s was used in the film about the 1940s. So it's a great way of piecing together why we see type today, why we see typography changes, particularly with the internet, the way that kind of changed type as well. But I recommend that book for sure. It's a great book.
Thank you for the recommendations, and especially for showing us your work. It's really interesting, and I can say, like, looking for the context and the concepts behind it, it's really amazing. So thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. ¿Tienen alguna pregunta adicional? No? Okay. Your work is amazing. Your research is fascinating. How you connect the information in these publications too. And I'm really, really glad to be here with you today. And that's it. Thank you very much for being here again. Okay.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks everybody for listening. I hope I wasn't speaking too fast there. Irish people speaking very fast. But I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much, Killian.
Thanks very much. Cheers. I'll talk to you later. See you later, guys.
See you. Bye-bye. Thank you very much. Adiós.
Bye. Thank you.
A ver, digan adiós.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Bye-bye.